In any medium of art, there's a lot of room for interpretation, and cinema is no exception. There are many great films out there that received love decades after their release. There are films that we can all agree failed to live up to even our most meager expectations of what a film should be, and of course there are plenty of films that proved successful with audiences but left critics disappointed. This is a video about the films that fall somewhere in the middle, movies that weren't denounced entirely but in my opinion are simply much better than most seem to give them credit for. Number 5. The Counselor, a film directed by Ridley Scott from an original screenplay written by novelist Cormac McCarthy, who many of you may know as the writer of the Coen brothers' No Country for Old Men. The story involves a character known only as the Counselor who finds himself involved in the world of drug trafficking. Featuring an all-star supporting cast including Javier Bardem, Penelope Cruz, Brad Pitt, and in a shockingly acceptable performance, Cameron Diaz. And with Scott at the helm, it seemed to everyone we had a great film to look forward to, but almost everyone who paid to see it left unsatisfied. Complaints of a long runtime, unrealistic and pretentious dialogue, as well as poor pacing being the biggest reasons for its disfavor with audiences. There were a few critics who loved it, and they really loved it, and I tend to agree with them. The film is a slow burn that's not afraid to make you wait for the payoff. It's not afraid to elevate reality with pontificating symbolic dialogue, nor is it afraid to go into very dark territory. It's a movie that goes against conventions of the typical drug-related action movie by having most of the film focus on the relationships between the characters, all while building a tension that explodes in the third act. I think it's a great film, and I think critics will come around to think so too before too long, as is what tends to happen with non-traditional films like this one. At least one can hope. Number 4. Punch Drunk Love. This is the one film in writer-director Paul Thomas Anderson's career that really stands out as being different. He made himself known to the cinematic world with Boogie Nights and continued to show his talent with more cerebral films like There Will Be Blood and The Master. But where those films delve deep into the human psyche, tackling subjects like lust or greed, Punch Drunk Love is a pure old-fashioned love story, albeit with a twist on the genre that only someone like PTA could bring. It follows Barry Egan as he finds the woman of his dreams, battles blackmail from a mattress salesman operating a phone sex hotline, and buying every case of pudding he can get his hands on to attain frequent flyer miles. It's a comedy and a romance, and it tends to alienate a lot of fans of Anderson's because of such a strong shift in tone from what we'd come to expect from him, but I think it's a great film that features an Oscar-worthy performance from Adam Sandler, as well as great turns from Philip Seymour Hoffman and Emily Watson. I agree with many that it certainly isn't Anderson's masterpiece, but one that seems to have been brushed under the rug when compared to his other films, and it's one that I'd like to see more people talking about. It's a film that's short, sweet, and to the point, and will keep you smiling until the credits roll. Number 3. Death Proof. Quentin Tarantino has made himself a household name with films like Pulp Fiction and Django Unchained, always garnering praise for his dialogue and choice of music. Death Proof was originally released as a double feature called Grindhouse, paired with Robert Rodriguez's Planet Terror. It's the story of two separate groups of women who are tormented by stuntman Mike and his death-proof car. It's the closest Tarantino has ever gotten to horror, and it's a send-up to old Grindhouse films of the 70s with the film grain and soundtrack to go with it. It may not be a perfect film, it's certainly not the best Tarantino has ever done, but it's a fun ride the whole way through. The film creates such a great atmosphere, and it, like many of his films, features a great cast of strong female characters. The biggest complaint people seem to have about this movie is that it's boring, but I would argue that all of these boring scenes are crucial for character development and story. If the whole movie was all action and car chases, there wouldn't be any substance, and we as an audience wouldn't care about what was happening to any of the characters. We have to be drawn into their world, and it has to feel like our world does, or nothing that follows has any importance. Granted, this effect seemed to be lost on most people, the people who weren't looking for character development or story, but thrilling action. And that's fine, not every movie is to everyone's taste, but expectations need to be managed with movies like this. Don't go in expecting a big-budget action movie, go instead expecting a more intimate portrait of women who get caught up in a dangerous game with a psychopath, and I think the movie will play very differently for you. It's not high-octane action from start to finish. It does have great moments of action, but they only work so well because of the slower scenes that came before them. But that is just one opinion, though if any of this sounds appealing to you, I highly recommend you go and see it. And for any feminists out there who were pleasantly surprised by Mad Max Fury Road, I think this might just be up your alley. It's pure popcorn entertainment at its finest, and a film quite unlike the rest of Tarantino's collection. Number 2. Zodiac. It's the dramatization of the true story of the Zodiac Killer, with David Fincher directing a script written by James Vanderbilt. It follows the investigation of several murders over a span of nearly a decade, where a cartoonist named Robert Graysmith becomes obsessed with tracking down the infamous killer. There seems to be a trend with Fincher's films where they tend to receive more praise as the years go by. Films like Seven and Fight Club were met with lukewarm reviews upon release, but now are consistently ranked as some of the best films of all time, but this has yet to happen for this film. Similarly to other films on this list, complaints of a slow pace and long runtime seem to be the main point of contention with critics and audiences alike, which in my opinion comes from an innate misunderstanding of film. The story takes place over a long period of time with lots of information to work through. The long runtime just ensures that we don't miss anything important. The slow pace ensures that we feel the passing of time. This isn't a film for people looking for a quick and easy thriller. It's a complicated look at the real people who were chasing down a killer, and it doesn't always paint such a clear picture. This is the first film on this list I would consider to be a masterpiece, and I think it's miles ahead of Seven. There isn't a single frame of this film that isn't gorgeous. Every word of dialogue is fantastic, and delivered to perfection by an all-star cast including Jake Gyllenhaal, as well as pre-Avengers Robert Downey Jr. and Mark Ruffalo. David Fincher masterfully shows us the untold story that captured the world's attention and even inspired films like Dirty Harry. It's a detective story unlike any I've ever seen, one that isn't afraid to leave some questions unanswered or make you do some of the detective work for yourself. This is a must-see for any fans of Fincher's or anyone who's just looking for a captivating story about a serial killer. Number 1. Eyes Wide Shut, the final film from legendary filmmaker Stanley Kubrick, inspired by a novella titled Dream Story written by Arthur Schnitzler. It's the story of Bill Harford, a doctor from New York City, and the odyssey of sexual exploration and paranoia that follows a conversation with his wife in which she tells him of a time she almost cheated on him. It's a story that is made all the more interesting by the fact that Tom Cruise and Nicole Kidman were in fact married in real life at the time, something I'm sure Kubrick was keen on. For those unfamiliar, Stanley Kubrick has one of the most iconic filmographies of any filmmaker. He directed The Shining, A Clockwork Orange, Spartacus. Every film he released was showered with adulation, sometimes upon the release of the film and sometimes years later, but there isn't a single film of his entire career whose quality falls under question, save for Eyes Wide Shut. Sure, everyone has their preferences. Some prefer Barry Lyndon to Full Metal Jacket, some prefer Paths of Glory to Dr. Strangelove, but Eyes Wide Shut remains to be his one film that people don't seem to respond to, his one misunderstood masterpiece. I guess it's fitting that it was indeed his last. He died mere days after completing the final edits on the film. Some people were divided on the length of the film. For some it was the graphic depiction of sex in certain scenes, and a lot of people were simply confused by the plot. The film is an odyssey, a psychedelic journey that feels so much like a dream it's unsettling. It's not always straightforward, you don't always know what's real and what's not, when Harford is really in danger and when he's just paranoid. Kubrick was famous for giving you the questions but making you find the answers. He lived in ambiguity, and that's what made him the master that he was. The reason that most of his films have held up so well after so many years is because of how much love went into every frame. There's always something more to find beneath the surface of a Kubrick film. He leaves so much for the viewer to decide, to make the film their own. Because in any medium of art, there's always room for interpretation, and what a dull world it would be if that weren't true. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.